Investment in securities market are subject to market risks. Read all the related documents carefully before investing. Welcome to the Pāri Washington podcast, a show about long-term investing. It's about finding excellent businesses run by excellent people, and more importantly, seeing how they grow and endure. It's also about investing with discipline and really investing in companies when the prices are right. Over time, we keep coming back to one idea at Pāri Washington, that of corporate culture, not mission statements or office posters, but really the habits and incentives that shape a business. Joining me today is Arun Veerappan, Analyst and Managing Director at Pāri Washington. Welcome, Arun.
Thanks, Anu.
Arun, now, before we get into culture, could we actually talk a little bit about yourself and also about Pāri Washington?
Sure. Pāri Washington is an old-fashioned investment firm. We look for excellent businesses run by excellent people at reasonable prices. That's easy to say, hard to do. But the process of getting there is what I find intellectually stimulating. And I'm very cognizant that our process is both intellectually stimulating and eventually leads to financial outcomes for us as well. But it's the existence of the former, the intellectual piece, that makes the latter possible and even enduring.
Yeah.
So that's about the firm. About me, I'm originally from Madurai. I went to a boarding school, Rishi Valley, and then I was fortunate I had a scholarship to attend college in the United States. I went to Tulane University. I have a degree in engineering and a degree in economics, both at the bachelor's level. And then I went to work for a firm called Robertson Stevens in San Francisco. I started at the entry level, equity research associate, and I eventually went on to serve as a managing director. I lived and worked in the United States for about 16 years before returning home at the end of 2006. And I've been at Pāri Washington ever since.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about the schools that you went to, both Rishi Valley as well as Tulane.
Yeah.
How did that actually influence your kind of processes and your work?
Well, look, I sort of grew up at both places, right? I went to Rishi Valley at age 11. I went to Tulane at age 18. So from school, from Rishi Valley, I think I have an enduring love for the outdoors, formative early experiences that developed my liking for the English language and its literature, poetry, etc. And also the social studies. That's what we called it in seventh grade. So I had two very good teachers, Raja Balasubramanian and Rajesh Dalal, but many others too. So that was Rishi Valley. Tulane was significantly more formative in the sense that I'd also grown. I was able to read extensively, and the material to read was extensively available. The libraries there are quite significantly different from the ones that we have access to here. But also, I was able to, the concept of liberal arts, you learn across disciplines. So that the entire experience, I think, was quite nourishing, and I'm very grateful for having been at both places.
Arun, when you hear the phrase corporate culture, what would you say it is about? How would you describe it? And what's maybe the first thing that comes in mind to you?
The first thing that comes to mind is culture's foundational value to a business. So much as a foundation is critical for the structural stability and longevity of a building, culture plays that same role for a business. I said I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area for a long time. It's set in a seismic zone, and San Francisco's high-rise and skyline developed only in the 1960s, whereas, as you know, in the United States, New York began to develop a pretty high-quality high-rise skyline beginning the 1930s. And the reason is that the architects needed to get a foundational structure that was both strong as well as agile, with agility being equally of importance to be able to handle earthquakes. So that's an example of how that can translate into businesses. But also, we're sitting here in Chennai, and I'm forever drawn to the Thiruvasagam. And there's this particular phrase. I'll say it in Tamil first. It's Akkuvai, Kappai, Alippai, Arul Taruvai. So when you translate, it's you must create, you must protect that which you've created, which is good, destroy that which you've created, which isn't, all in the pursuit of wisdom. Now, if you think about it, right, create, protect, and destroy, all in the pursuit of wisdom, that is what culture ought to be, right? You've got to create and make sure that that creation endures. And that's foundational right there.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. No, absolutely. In fact, when you're talking about this idea of, creating, enduring, and destruction, it actually reminds me of this idea of the mandala itself, which is this Buddhist,
Yes.
pattern that's created, which is they spend a lot of time creating it, and then as soon as it's done, they just sweep it away, because the process and the fact that things need to keep changing, So yeah, I totally agree with you.
That's right. And this is a good example of how all roads, if the destination is something of consequence, there are multiple roads to get there.
Yes.
So,
yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we spoke about the Thiruvasagam, and
Yes.
it's obviously a beautiful way of looking at, how corporate culture can actually endure and also change, and that's very important. Now, in the real world, you visit so many companies as part of our research process. What does corporate culture actually feel like within a company?
See, I think in the ultimate analysis, Anu, culture ought to be a measure of a company's ability to operate efficiently. It certainly has tremendous predictive value. So from the outside, we typically get to see the leader, and if a leader has clarity of purpose, it's assumed that the company does. But in practice, it's important to get a sense of whether leadership, actually whether culture transcends leadership and flows to the ground. So I'm typically looking for a few attributes. I'll expand on them in a bit, but knowledge first. Second is hiring and training. Third is hunger and dissent. And fourth is caring. So why do these attributes have importance? Now, if there's a paranoia company-wide to acquire and act on knowledge, I think that's a pretty good institution, something that can perpetuate. But how does that happen? It happens because of people, right? So we pay deep attention to hiring engines, a company's ability to hire high-quality young people and train them so that they are steeped in the company's culture today, but more importantly, so that they can shape the company's culture tomorrow. In terms of hunger and dissent, this is pretty critical because it speaks to alignments of incentives, and we can touch upon this later if you like. But the hungry are very, very, very conscious that in order to get from point A to point B, whatever obstacles exist, they want to push it away. And if it exists, they're happy to dissent.
Yeah.
And I think companies ought to have such an engine institutionalized within themselves. And finally comes the aspect of caring, right? And caring has a whole spectrum of meanings, but beginning at its most basic level with an attention to detail, right? Do you care about the small things? And all the way to the other end, do you care for your customer? Do you care for your vendors? And most importantly, do you care for your people? Does a company care for its people?
Yeah.
So these are the attributes that we're looking for to ensure that a business can not just survive, but thrive. And all of that speak to what we call culture.
Yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I think when you're, again, referring back to the fact that you believe that culture keeps changing, it's only the people who come into the company, whether younger or at the higher level, they are the ones that are transforming the company because they are seeing what's missing and then, asking for things to change, right? So that really matters a lot.
That's right. And if I might, right, I'd mentioned that we pay deep attention to the hiring and training engines. And I spoke of that in the concept of young blood, fresh from college, etc. But I think it's also important that a company ought to have selective lateral hiring engines, because if you only focus on training from the ground up, we can sometimes get caught up in our own bullshit, right? Because it becomes incestuous.
Yeah.
So when you can inject new blood into any system, I think that brings a diversity of perspective, and injects new energy as well. So
Yeah.
I think both are important.
Yeah. Now, moving on to the work itself of evaluating companies and management teams. Why do you think culture deserves more attention, beyond the numbers, beyond the balance sheet or the profit and loss statements?
We live in an AI world, right? And while it hasn't happened as yet, I think it's imminent. We should be able to use Claude to tell it that this is the kind of research that we typically do. We begin with the building of a financial model, and not just an income statement, balance sheet, cash flow statement, but in the particular way that I'm used to, so that it can render itself better to my analysis.
Right.
And Claude will do all of that for you with just the press of a button. That'll happen. That's happening today.
Yeah.
But Claude can go one step further and research anything and everything that's available on the company and its top people. And it can answer some of the key questions that I'm looking to answer as part of my research process. But here's the catch. Claude can only do it based on what's already available.
Right.
So in a sense, Claude is able to act based on what's already happened, the past. But culture, I mentioned it has predictive value, and a good understanding of culture is what will tell me where the business can possibly go. So I don't want to be looking in a rearview mirror, right? I want to be sensing where the puck can go so that I can skate in that direction. And I think that's the great advantage of culture, which AI is not going to be able to do that easily.
There are also other things that we as a company look at. I remember when I started with Pāri Washington earlier this year, when I sat in at our research meetings that happen every day, one of the things that struck me is how we're looking at other things that I would have normally not even thought of, like the lunchroom in an office setup, whether the top management and the workers actually sit together and eat. Talk a little bit about that.
That's right, Anu. It's in the appreciation of fine and small detail that I think the bigger picture, the larger story gets uncovered. Often in investing, people say follow the money, right? Based on the assumption that the big investors have a acute sense of where the market's going. So if you follow their money, you typically know where things are going. We have a slightly different philosophy. It's follow the food, right? So, and pardon me if some of my examples are a little too earthy, but I'll start with the intake portion of follow the food. We like to see where people are eating, right? Is the company all eating together? Is there one cafeteria? Multiple parts of the hierarchy? Do they have different eating spaces? And we also pay attention to the din in the cafeteria, right? If I'm going to spend 45 minutes of my day relaxing, I want to know that I'm eating high quality food. I'm eating it in a spirit of camaraderie. I'm having fun, and I'd like to hear joking and things like that in the cafeteria. And if that's not the case, and there's hierarchical eating spaces, that tells me a story, albeit a different one. So now I follow that food all the way to the end, right? The outflow. I also like to visit the restrooms, particularly the blue collar restroom in the factory. And as you're, I'm sure, aware, in India, if you have a certain sized workforce, the janitor is required by law
Right.
to sign off saying that, I've cleaned the restroom every so often. And look, I don't need the restroom to be of very high caliber in terms of, expensive sanitary ware, but it needs to be
Fittings and all that.
functional.
Yeah.
And it needs to be clean. That tells me if that caring is placed to ensure that this follow the food chain from beginning to end is working perfectly, I have a pretty good degree of confidence that the rest of the system is also working perfectly.
Yeah.
So that's a sense of what we do.
Are there certain moments, stressful moments or even crisis moments where a company's culture suddenly becomes more visible?
Certainly, I think in times of stress or in times of difficulty, I think the most critical question is the room or is the company big enough for the truth to exist in it? And if the answer is in the affirmative, you can typically see that there's at least a concerted effort to get out of that crisis situation and to do it in a thoughtful fashion with also a united front to battle together. But if that doesn't exist, if there's no truth, that's also predictive in value and will tell you that the crisis can lead to a pretty suboptimal outcome. And I'm always drawn to instructive moments in business history. And Andy Grove stands out. He was a refugee from Hungary into the United States, came to the United States in his teens, educated there, and then went on to work for Fairchild, the mothership of one of the motherships of the semiconductor industry, and then went on to co-found Intel with Gordon Moore and Bob Noyce.
Yeah.
And to put things in perspective, Intel back then was to the semiconductor industry what NVIDIA, Broadcom, Micron, all of them were together, right? So it had that kind of power. And it was synonymous with memory chips. And I'm referring to the late 70s and early 80s, this timeline. Japan incorporated after 30 years of extraordinarily hard work. Japan has a culture of uniformity. There's advantages to that and disadvantages to it.
Right.
But on the advantages side is the fact that there's sort of missionary zeal within the workforce to get to a particular outcome, and they leave nothing to chance to get there. Japan was making very high quality, very cost-effective memory devices and giving Intel a run for its money. So much so that Intel was making losses. Right? The great Intel was making losses. There was something called the 10% rule, where Japan said, I want every Intel socket that's out there in the world.
Yeah.
And if Intel competes, bring the price down by 10%. And if Intel matches that, bring it down by another 10%.
Right.
And keep doing that until we win. And this was the scenario that Andy Grove and Gordon Moore were confronted with. Andy and Gordon were reportedly in a room when Andy is said to have gone to Gordon and asked, what do you think would happen if the board got rid of us? And Gordon is said to have responded, geez, Andy, that's a pretty easy one. The board bring in new people, and those guys, I guess, the hell out of the memory business. And so Andy reflected upon that and said to Gordon, look, let's get out of the room, come right back in. We're new management now.
Yeah.
And let's get out of the memory business. Now, that's a momentous decision, right? That's a clear example of truth residing within a room. Two people willing to speak hard truths to each other and willing to take tough action thereafter, right? Seeking knowledge and then acting on that knowledge and getting Intel out of the memory business, something that it was synonymous with, something that it spent decades building. And the rest is history, because Intel went on to become, a pioneering microprocessing semiconductor company. But what's also instructive is how Andy described the relationship between Gordon Moore and himself. He said that Gordon's the thinker and I'm the activist. Now, that has a ring to it for me, and it impacts me quite deeply, because companies must have both. They must have thinkers, but they must equally have activists. The role of an activist, the job of an activist, is a relentless job. It's a thankless job. But without the existence of activists, you don't have a company that can execute on the knowledge that it's acquired. So I think that's both a sign of what happens in a time of crisis, when people can speak the truth to each other and can execute on that truth once they've found it.
Yeah. I think Intel is a great example of how a company can actually become big. And because of the way the founders of the company are and the courage that they have, that they can actually make a change. They can actually pivot and do something different to survive, right? But is it actually difficult, in normal cases or in regular companies, when the companies grow bigger? Is it difficult to kind of hold on to culture? Because it's when you're small and nifty, you kind of have a very small group of people. And it's kind of easier to kind of have a culture that's, going on swimmingly. But as a company grows bigger, how do you hang on to something like that?
Sure. You're absolutely right. Business growth is usually inversely proportional to the preservation of culture, right? Building culture is one half the battle. Scaling culture is an equally important other half of the battle, which ain't easy. So Intel, yes and no. It's instructive that while Andy Grove was around, he was third generation CEO, they were able to preserve that culture and scale that culture and scale the business and pivot, as you said, from memory to microprocessing. But Intel is also a good example of how that culture did not transcend successfully beyond Andy Grove. So I think it's important to keep that in perspective as well. And in a sense, right, that speaks to our, what we call internally, our cycle of capitalism, or the 11 o'clock philosophy. If every great company stayed great forever, it'd be very rare for young startups to become great, right? So you need that clearing away of debris, so to speak. So you want the cycle of capitalism to manifest itself. But look at it in the form of a clock, right? With success at 12 o'clock or noon. And success eventually always will lead to complacency, right? Put complacency at 3 o'clock. And the reason that happens is because of this concept of entropy that we'd spoken about earlier. Going from complacency, it's almost 99.9% the case that the complacent will eventually fail. And failure is at 6 o'clock. But to go from failure back to hunger, it ain't easy at all, right? Not everybody who's failed has the ability to pick themselves up, fight the fight, the good fight, or fights, I should say, in the plural, and get back to being hungry. And here's what's even more ironic, right, or more relevant. Those that are hungry rarely get to being successful again. If hunger is at 9, getting back to 12 o'clock, where success is very rare. And why is that? It's because of this concept called luck, right? Think about it, and I always personalize things, right? I was born 25 years, a quarter century after India's independence, and I'm coming into my own 75 years after independence. And the country has achieved a certain scale which allows me to build a business, which allows me to invest in businesses that themselves have the ability to acquire critical mass. But you go back to my parents' generation, they were born at the time of independence. They worked as hard as I did, perhaps harder, certainly harder than I did.
Yeah.
And they just did not have the luck. The country was not in that same place. So being in the right place at the right time, luck matters a great deal as well. So when you look at it from the perspective of this clock, it's very important that you operate at 11,
Right.
at 11 o'clock, right? That's that unique period, unique time, unique hour where success begets hunger and hunger leads back to success.
Right.
So we work very hard to find businesses that are able to operate at that 11 o'clock hour
Yeah.
and prevent the cycle of capitalism from playing itself through.
Yeah.
There are a few companies that can do that, but those are the ones that we want to invest in.
Yeah. No, absolutely. The Goldilocks situation is absolutely important, which is where luck plays such a good, such a big role. And of course,
Absolutely.
when you're talking about reinventing, I can't help by, kind of swerving into some sports analogies of, say, a Virat Kohli or even
Yes.
a Rafael Nadal
Yes.
in tennis.
Yes.
Because these guys actually kind of kept, at it. They kept reinventing themselves. They kept, being fit
Yes.
and things like that to actually
Yes.
stay up,
Yes. Yes.
in a sense,
Yes.
in the sport that they're
Yes.
playing in. So
Yes.
yeah, as soon as you
Yes.
said that, about
Yes.
reinventing, and
Yes.
it just struck me
Yes.
that, these two people actually came to mind.
Yeah, that's a good analogy, and let's stay with that for a little bit and use it view it from a tennis prism. I like John McEnroe very much, right? That's the generation that
The bad boy of
yes,
tennis.
Yes.
Yeah.
He had character, right? He had guts, and he tried to teach the referee a thing or two every time. But that character draws us to him. But now let's flip it to somebody like a Federer or a Nadal. These guys, as you said, reinvented themselves. They were very disciplined, and the difference shows. I mean, I don't know how many Grand Slams McEnroe won, but it was maybe 6, maybe. And here you have Federer with 20 plus.
Yeah.
And these guys.
And
have
Nadal with 14 French Open titles.
14 French Open titles, yes, and 20 Grand Slams, I think. The ability to play on multiple surfaces, that's an indication of your ability to pivot. So I think the reason this is important is we as human beings tend to gravitate towards that which is attractive on day one. And attractive is typically, I don't mean this in the McEnroe sense, because I've also seen him in Mindy Kaling's role of a narrator, and so he pivoted quite well.
Right.
But in the tennis world, what was attractive led to 6 Grand Slams, and what was the slog, the ability to do something again and again and again and again,
Yeah.
relentlessly led to 20 Grand Slams. That's very instructive, and I don't think we ought to take our eyes off that for a moment.
Yeah. Now, coming back to the corporate arena from the tennis court, when you follow a company for decades, that's something that we do at Pāri Washington. Even before we invest in a company, we are studying them for years. That's how our research process is. Now, when we follow a company over decades, how do you see culture actually shaping the outcome? Or, where does culture actually show up in long-term performance?
Yeah. So I'll start by saying it's in an analysis of the small detail that you can actually paint the larger picture. We've always believed that the nuance, appreciating the nuance, can give you much more than what the nuance itself stands for. Right? In all of Naipaul's writing, particularly his travel writing, he's always visiting and speaking with the little guy. And from those stories, he's crafting a much larger narrative. And so, for people like us, when we're looking at a company from the outside, leadership, or at least an analysis of leadership, when leadership has clarity of purpose, one would think that the company has clarity of purpose as well. But there are small nuggets of information that tell you whether that's transcending down to the ground. I remember a time when my colleague Aruna and I, we visited one of our companies. We visited the factory,
Right.
and in particular, we were touring through one manufacturing line. Now, the way a manufacturing line typically works is you have raw material and component inventory on one side that flows down through the manufacturing line, and then on the other side you have finished goods. And on this particular day, we saw component inventory to a minimum. The manufacturing line was humming, and we saw very little finished goods inventory. And there was a young man, a blue-collar member of the workforce, that we chanced upon. We asked him, why don't you have much inventory? I don't see inventory at the component level, nor do I see it at the finished goods level. And he looked at us somewhat puzzled, and then chose to give us a lesson, right? And I was deeply appreciative for what I learned in that process.
Right.
He said, inventory is like dead bodies, right? The more they accumulate, the more they stink, because they consume much of your precious capital. And shame on you if you accumulate inventory. And I came away from that, Aruna and I, we came away from it thinking, here's a great example of how culture transcends from the top all the way down to the ground. And it's important to look at it, top leadership, blue-collar workforce, and also middle-level management. And here, in actually one of our existing companies many years ago, I'd met a mid-level officer, and he told me that the company, by the way, had gone through many years of difficulty, and they were now on the ascend. And this gentleman had been with the company for a couple of decades. And he said, I've been through a lot of difficulty, but now I'm rising. I bought a company in France last year. I bought a company in the United States this year, and they're going to be visiting me soon. And I loved a couple of things here. The fact that he was personalizing everything. The fact that there was no daylight between him and the company, right? The two were fused in his mind. And to me, that's a great sign of clarity of purpose transcending from the top down to the bottom. It's guys like him that make that blue-collar worker understand what a company shouldn't be doing, and vice versa. I think that blue-collar worker, because of his appreciation of what's going on the ground, is able to push feedback up the chain as well, and that makes for a lovely, lovely ecosystem, right? So.
Yeah. I think it also makes us as investors feel like,
Yes.
We actually own the company, right? And not just have a stake in the company, right? I think that ownership, just like
Yes. Yeah.
this blue-collar worker felt that he is kind of an
Yes.
owner in the company. There is a sense of ownership there.
Absolutely, absolutely. And when that occurs, right, I think there's much beauty to it. And in a sense, right, when you ask what is the purpose of it all, or where must it manifest itself? It manifests itself in people, right? Great people in turn build great products or services, and great products or services in turn deliver great profits. But here again is the nuance, right? People who understand the difference between profits and cash can actually go on to build a phenomenal balance sheet, right? So what I'm always looking for, we're always searching at Pāri Washington, we're always searching for beauty. And I think that beauty is much evident. It's manifest in a fortress-like balance sheet. I think that's the ultimate arbiter
Right.
of whether a company's able to successfully keep going on or not.
Right, right. No, thank you very much for your time, Arun. I think this has been a really grounding conversation. and a very good place for us to start this series, because every business clearly has culture. And I think for investors, understanding it and getting a sense of it can really make a difference between a costly mistake and a good bet. So in that sense, understanding culture goes beyond numbers, and kind of reveals something in the future for investors. For a deeper dive, do look at the article linked below. And thank you very much for listening. Do drop in your questions and messages for us. We read everything. Yeah, so we're done now.
Thanks,
We can
Anu.
just-
Have you seen that Mindy Kaling show? I'm forgetting the name now.
Yeah, what was it? I'm
It's
forgetting
about
it.
this little girl called Baby.
Yes,
And,
is it Bridgerton?
yeah.
Never.
Never have I. So, yeah, trust me.